revisits the cases which feature in psychology textbooks around the world. This week it's the turn of the man known to science simply as SB, whose case transformed the field of visual perception. We join Claudia in London's Regent's Park.
It was just over 50 years ago, here at London Zoo, that a middle-aged man known as SB saw an elephant for the first time in his life. Not that unusual, perhaps, except that this was one of many firsts for SB. Having been blind since he was a baby, at the age of 52, his sight was restored. But rather than gaining a new lease of life, SB became the man famous for being disappointed with what he saw.
In about 20 or 30 cases in which there has been a chance to restore people's sight, a lot of them really don't work out well.
I think we should blame ourselves to some extent. I don't think those of us who tried to look after him realised what a traumatic situation this was and how difficult it was for him.
It's so counterintuitive, the idea that regaining this sort of critical sense should have this effect on somebody.
If sight is going to be restored, the earlier the better. And there may be a period after early childhood where it is difficult to learn to see.
There was a wonderful moment when he ran his hand, he touched it, and he said, "Now I've touched it, I can see."
Where we're sitting now, you can sometimes see giraffes poking their heads over the top of their...
Exactly. He saw two giraffes with their heads sticking out. Do you know, it was the only situation I can remember where he saw something and actually laughed and thought it was funny.
As we sat in Regent's Park for what turned out to be one of Richard Gregory's last broadcast interviews before he died in May this year, he told me he remembered the time he spent with SB in London half a century ago as though it were yesterday. Richard Gregory was Emeritus Professor of Neuropsychology at Bristol University and a world-renowned expert in visual perception. But back in January 1959, he was a lecturer in the Experimental Psychology Department at Cambridge when he became involved in the case study that would make his name.
I heard about SB through my assistant at that time, Jean Wallace, and she saw in her local newspaper that this operation was going to take place. Somebody blind all his life and apparently getting sight back. And it was rather odd. We were the only psychologists who actually responded or did anything about it. But anyway, we did, and I'm glad we did.
Such cases of sight restored from childhood blindness are extremely rare, though they have always intrigued philosophers. Back in the 17th century, Molyneux had posed the question.
Suppose a man born blind and now adult and taught by his touch to distinguish between a cube and a sphere of the same metal. Suppose, then, the cube and sphere were placed on a table and the blind man made to see. Query: whether by his sight, before he touched them, could he distinguish and tell which was the globe and which the cube?
So now Richard Gregory and Jean Wallace would have the opportunity to find out. They swiftly contacted the surgeon who'd operated on SB, and he wrote back,
Dear Mr. Gregory, thank you for the letter regarding a patient of mine who, as you know, underwent a corneal graft operation a month ago. I have myself been very interested to note how quickly he readjusted himself to the vision he gained after operation. Prior to the operation, he only had light perception in the first operated eye. In the other eye, he could perceive vague hand movements close to his face. Born in 1906, he lost his sight at the age of 10 months after smallpox vaccination and was trained as a blind person from the age of 7 to 18 years at the Birmingham Blind Institute. As you know, I operated on his second eye a fortnight ago, and I hope the visual result will be equally satisfactory for him. He will probably be staying another week or so in the Wolverhampton Eye Infirmary, and if you would like to see him yourself and carry out any tests, you would be more than welcome. I look forward to discussing Mr. B's case with you.
So we dropped everything, and I filled up my car with all the apparatus I could think of from my practical class, because I wanted to do experiments on him.
Who was SB? What do we know about his life?
Well, his name was Sidney Bradford. He mended shoes and made shoes as a trade. He was just an ordinary very sort of taciturn Midlands English chap. You know, there was nothing special about him at all, really. He had a rather limited sense of humour, but he was reliable, he was a good witness, he was very honest, he never exaggerated. So in that sense, he was a very good subject for experiments.
And so you turned up at the hospital with your car full of equipment, ready to experiment on him.
That's right.
And what happened next? I mean, how were you received?
He was wonderful. He entered into it. From the very beginning, he could see movement extremely well. If anything moved, he was onto it. And he couldn't recognise a face unless it moved. And he couldn't recognise his friends if they were still. He would spend a lot of time looking at his friends in mirrors. There was a bar that he would go to in the evenings, and his friends would have a beer with him. This is a magic thing to him, that he could look in the mirror, see his friend, put his hand out, and then couldn't touch them. The separation of touch and vision was a miracle to him.
Did you try out optical illusions on him?
Oh, yes, I tried every optical illusion under the sun with him, yeah. And some of them he didn't have. For example, the Necker cube, which is a famous one, which is an outline drawing of a cube, which for us flips in and out spontaneously, so that a given face looks in front and then it looks at the back and it changes. It didn't for him, and it didn't look in 3 dimensions, it looked flat.
50 years after the case of SB, here at University College London's Institute of Ophthalmology, they're still investigating the mysteries of visual perception sparked by the case.
I'm Stephen Dakin. I'm a researcher at UCL Institute of Ophthalmology. All visual illusions are essentially about using context that something appears in to change its appearance. These are called the Titchener circles. So this is an illusion that probably most people have seen circulated on the internet. So what you have are essentially 2 identical circles surrounded either by a series of smaller circles or a series of larger circles. And what you experience is that the central circles don't look the same.
Yeah, so they almost look like 2 flowers, 2 daisies, and one of them's got a really big centre and one of them's got a really small centre.
Right. Even though the centres are actually physically identical, the fact that one's surrounded by smaller petals, if you will, makes the centre look larger, and the one surrounded by large petals looks smaller. And so what's going on here is really that we can't help, when we look at the central circles, but to make a judgment that is in some sense in relation to what's going on around it. That is, we can't ignore the context that these circles are appearing in. And this is an example of a very similar illusion to one of the ones that Richard Gregory used with SB, where the patient actually was immune to the illusion. They didn't show the usual kind of effect.
So it wouldn't seem like that to SB. It wouldn't seem as though the one with small petals has got a big centre.
That's right. Here, there is a physical difference. One of the discs is actually very slightly bigger on the right. Okay. Now, if you surround by big, even though this is physically bigger, it actually looks a bit smaller. Kids don't show this effect. What they're finding with children is that the size of the petals have really very little effect. They're much more immune to context for these kinds of effects. And what that suggests is it's our experience that critically determines how much context affects our perception of the world. And that's a very nice correspondence with the case study, because here we have somebody who does not experience these illusions, presumably because they do not have appropriate experience of the world.
After Sidney Bradford came out of hospital, Richard Gregory spent a number of days with him in London and brought him here to the Science Museum to see, of all things, tools.
One of the things that he wanted to be able to do was to use tools. He had a shed in his garden, and he really liked making things. And he thought once he got his sight, he'd be able to make lots of exciting things. I showed him these big steam engines here. He didn't make much of those.
Was it surprising to you, the things that did impress him and the things that didn't?
Yes, it was quite quixotic. Particularly this lathe we're going to look at, I think, the Maudsley lathe. He was utterly gripped by that.
It seems like an odd thing to want to see. It's not exactly beautiful or anything? Of all the things in the world you might
No,
want to
because
see?
he really wanted to be able to use a lathe, you know.
So this is Henry Maudsley's original screw-cutting lathe from around 1800, it says.
It's for making screw threads.
Oh, I see, and it can make different size threads for different screws, can it?
That's the cutting tool there with that little wheel in, and that runs along as it rotates, so it cuts a constant thread.
So they open the door and...
Yes, well, it was in a glass case, locked up, and I arranged for him to see it. He put his hand all over it and touched it.
And what did he say?
Well, he said something that struck me. He said, now I've touched it, I can see. It was really quite something.
Perhaps it's not surprising that touch remains such an important sense for someone who'd been blind all his life. But SB also provided evidence for a link between the senses that hadn't been established before.
When I first saw him in the hospital, I had a magazine sticking out of my pocket of my raincoat, which had a headline which was half in lowercase letters and half in uppercase letters. And he could read the uppercase letters, guess the rest of it.
How come he could read at all?
It turned out that in the blind school, he was taught uppercase letters by touch because it was only uppercase letters at that time which were used in notice boards and stuff like that.
And did we know before SB that you could transfer the knowledge from one sense to another?
And I think this was only established in chimpanzees a couple of years later, actually quite soon afterwards.
And he could tell the time as well. Presumably he was doing that with touch and transferring.
Yeah, absolutely right. He had this watch he put in his pocket. Instead of having glass on it, he just had a cover that opened, you know, and he could feel the time in that. And then I got an alarm clock from the nurses, and I set it to different times, and he could tell the time.
So you could read it without touching it?
Absolutely.
So you spent several days going off round London with him. Do we know how much he could see? I mean, if he was driving up the street like this now? Or
most of it would be pretty confusing to him. He wouldn't see it as we do. He'd have to stop and spend quite a lot of time looking at something. If things were moving past him, like in a car, fairly fast, he got completely confused. And a lot of things he saw he simply couldn't understand at all. Buildings, for example, if he looked at buildings like these buildings, they were just a confusing blur without meaning or form to him. He could cope with an individual door that he opened and shut, and he could walk through, but he couldn't understand the sort of structure of a whole building.
One of the very telling things was that although SB, when Richard Gregory first met him, he walked into the room without touching or finding his way. He was clearly using vision for apparently everyday purposes. Richard said that he wasn't scanning around the room. If he was directed to something, he would then look at it, scrutinise it, and give you his report of his impression of it. But he wasn't doing that thing that we all do. In a typical scene, people move their eyes maybe 5 times a second to seek out new visual information. And I think part of that probably relates back to this inability to use context properly. Context basically tells us what's salient. The reason visual illusions happen is because our brain is telling us that there's something salient within that pattern. And what we experience, what people label as a misperception, is actually just our brain trying to signal what's important in the scene. And what's evident from the fact that SB didn't experience visual illusions, and also that he didn't search visually around his environment, was that he was not using context appropriately.
I was doing a PhD on the reason why corneal transplants fail, and the case of SB came up in my literature search. I became fascinated by this amazing story, and I was also struck by the similarities with previous historical cases that I'd come across of recovery from early blindness.
Consultant ophthalmologist William Ailiff is Gresham Professor of Physics and has a special interest in the history of blindness.
The early cases concerned couching for cataract, which was an ancient medieval technique for removing cataract. The most celebrated of these cases was Cheselden's from St Thomas's in the early 1700s, when he couched a cataract on a 15-year-old boy who'd had congenital cataract. He, after his operation, felt that the visual world was so close it was touching his eye, something we take for granted, which is the visual space in front of us that we create by the mechanisms in the brain, we don't realise that it's actually something that's psychologically reconstructed and has to be learnt. He had difficulty imagining a house being bigger than the room he was in. He was aware that the room was part of the house, but he couldn't imagine something beyond. Again, suggesting that although we know where the direction of sight's coming from, we have difficulty imagining things beyond what would be a direct touch, which of course was how his world was construed before.
We are constantly inferring the structure of the world from often quite sketchy kind of evidence. So our past experience gives us very strong prior expectations about the way the world will be, which we're largely unaware of. But when you take away those prior expectations, that can actually have quite serious consequences for the visual system.
But sadly for SB, who had no past visual experience on which to build expectations, nothing quite lived up to the expectations that he did have. As time went on, everywhere he looked, what he saw was the dirt and flaking paintwork of a disappointing world.
He saw that the world of the sighted would be a complete revelation and a complete change of his lifestyle, which in fact it wasn't. And so there was always this underlying sense of disappointment. And then he, unfortunately, really got pretty depressed. I mean, clinically depressed, I would say. He was quite confused, I think, by his vision. Traffic is a good example. Before he got his sight back, he had a white stick. He'd put his stick out and simply charge across the road. But, and a sad thing to say, after the operation, he was scared to death of traffic. Jean and I literally had to hold him by both arms and drag him across the road. He actually, I think, felt handicapped for the first time in his life after the operation. I think before that he was a successful blind person. After the operation, he was a rather unsuccessful half-sighted person.
There are psychological implications of suddenly changing the way we perceive the world, almost overnight. And I think this can have profound effects. And it's interesting that SB didn't live to a very old and happy retirement.
But there have only been, how many cases do you think there have been in history of this?
Probably less than 24, and very few of those are as well documented as the case of SB or Cheselden's case or the case of MM.
We have a story so amazing, we have to bring it to you right now.
In 2001 in California, a 43-year-old man had a stem cell transplant in an attempt to restore his sight. This man, MM, once again referred to in the medical literature by his initials, was blinded in a chemical accident when he was 3 years old. 40 years later, local TV station Fox 40 had their cameras rolling when the bandages came off.
The first impression was this image of just whoosh, all of this light blasting into my eye at once.
I think the first thing you should see is your wife.
Hi, sweetie. Uh-oh. You're making a funny face.
Oh, yeah.
MM was happy to reveal his identity publicly. He's called Mike May. Sidney Bradford had famously been disappointed in his wife's face. Not so Mike May.
Come, baby.
And as I could sort of lean forward and screw up my face and look at her face, I could see her cheeks bunched up in a smile. I knew that a bunched up cheeks meant a smile, and I stared at her for a bit, and that's what she was doing.
I think the person learning to see, whether a baby or a case like this, is really like a scientist trying to understand what on earth's out there, what's going on, from failed or successful predictions. I think it's exactly what happened.
My visual acuity is roughly the same now as it was the day after the operation. What's changed is my ability to process information because I've had time to learn and to build up my visual library of clues. What that means is if I was walking down Oxford Street, I might say, well, that's a newspaper stand or that's a person. I couldn't tell the difference for maybe 10 seconds back in the beginning. Now I could look at that object and say, well, that's a person within 2 seconds. So I'm much faster. It's just that if you showed me small print on a card, the way that they measure vision for most people, I would still be rated the same as I was in the beginning.
And do you put those improvements then down to your brain having learnt, in a sense, how to cope with the signals that are coming into it from your eyes?
It's a matter of building up this visual library of clues. The first time it's hard to really identify them. Later on, these small bits of visual information can be picked up more quickly, more easily. It's the same as in learning a language. I'll never be a fluent visual person, but I might get better just over time with practice.
And are you finding that you're starting to rely on your eyesight more and more compared with your other senses?
No, what I learned after a couple of years was one sense is very overwhelming all by itself, and it's not that effective. So I learned that I had some very strong blindness skills, and I should use those things when appropriate in conjunction with the visual information. And that's an ongoing process where I'm learning to integrate the sensory perception from all these different channels.
Mike really doesn't rely on his vision for day-to-day activities at this point, so it's not really close to the kinds of vision that sighted people take for granted.
Brian Wandel is Chair of Psychology at Stanford University. He specialises in visual neuroscience, and just as Richard Gregory studied SB, he's been studying Mike May to see what he can learn about the way visual perception works in all of us. But he has the advantage today of being able to see inside Mike's brain using an fMRI scanner.
In normally developing brains, you have these cells that see very fine detail. They're good at resolving fine structure, like, the texture patterns on your wallpaper, fine patterns like this. Mike seems to be missing those cells. And at least I should say the responses from those cells. We can't detect that in his brain. He had his accident when he was 3. At that age, those very fine cells, those small cells, are just stabilizing in children's brains, and then they lock down. The hypothesis we have is that those cells maybe had just arrived when he was 3, but they stopped getting any signals because of the damage to his cornea and lens. And so they never got the fine patterns, on his retina. And as a result, they didn't lock down. And over the 40 years before the surgery, those cells basically went away.
So is it fair to say then that in a sense his eyes can see, but his brain can't see?
Well, as a vision scientist, I think all seeing is really in your brain.
We hear a lot these days about there being more plasticity in the brain than people used to realise. So is there any chance that over the years, it's been 10 years now, is there any chance that his sight might improve because could those cells grow back?
Everybody's brain is plastic. But it's probably not the case that every part of our brain is plastic. It would just be chaos in there. And one of the reasons why we particularly followed Mike is to try to understand whether the adult plasticity was great enough to let him recover from all those years of being sight deprived.
After nearly 10 years, it appears not. William Ailiff.
If sight is going to be restored, the earlier the better. And there may be a period after early childhood where it is difficult to learn to see. We know that for binocular vision, that's using 2 eyes together to see in the 3 dimensions, there seems to be a period up to about the age of 6 where the brain is plastic enough to be able to learn binocular vision if eye defects are corrected. And we know that after 6, this never develops and people remain without the ability, for example, to watch Avatar in 3 dimensions. Now, for more important aspects of vision, such as recognising colours, shapes at a distance and so on, this may be a completely different plastic period. It appears that facial recognition might be a particular skill that needs to be learnt early on, and the ability to recognise hundreds and thousands of different faces may well be compromised if you don't cure blindness at an early stage.
My ability to see color is good as a fully sighted person. My ability to see motion is very good. I'm very weak in terms of depth perception and detail perception, which also means face recognition. So I can't see any of the details, but yet I can run and catch a ball in the air.
Mike also continues to ski very fast. He won bronze in the 1984 Paralympics in the alpine downhill. Unlike SB, who became depressed, got ill with shingles and in the end died within 2 years of the operation that restored his sight, Mike remains supremely positive.
There's a lot of differences between SB and I. For one thing, I've had a lot more time to learn to use the visual information, and so that time has given me the ability to build up this visual library, to get used to it, to learn about integration. I think he never really progressed to the point where he could take full advantage of the sight. Plus the fact that we had different circumstances. I embrace change, I enjoy it, I'm excited by it, and this wasn't necessarily the case with him. And certainly when one gets their vision back after long-term blindness, change is a big part of what's happening. It's very overwhelming.
I don't think those of us who tried to look after him realised what a traumatic situation this was and how difficult it was for him. So I think to some extent we were to blame for this.
Did he have any sense of how unusual his case was, or that he was going to become a famous case study?
Oh, yes, indeed. In fact, he became quite famous. I mean, there were newspaper articles on him, and he loved all that, of course. One of the newspapers wanted to take him to Marrakesh. Winston Churchill liked it very much, and I think it was through Churchill that it was rather famous at that time, and he was tickled to death for this. But unfortunately, that was one of the disappointments of his life that never actually came off.
But although SB may have been disappointed in the impact regaining his sight had on his own life, the impact on our understanding of visual perception was considerable. Without SB, how long would it have taken scientists to discover that it's not our eyes on their own doing the seeing, it's our brains learning to make sense of what they see? And maybe it tells us something about our own expectations too. Like me, Stephen Dakin first heard of SB in an undergraduate psychology lecture, and like most sighted people, he assumed that once he was able to see, SB would live happily ever after.
It became evident that SB had suffered some psychological trauma from the actual experience, which I think was really surprising to us, as I think it is to most people. And it increasingly became clear that things didn't end well for SB. And it was a moving experience in the lecture. And at the time, it struck me that this was a very unusual piece of science writing compared to the other papers that we've been doing, because it was a real story.
Did that contribute to getting you interested in the whole area of visual perception?
Yes, it did. Typically, intervention now for these kinds of visual disorders is very early on, and corneal grafts would happen in the first few years. So this is the advance of medical science. This is great, but it is one unfortunate from a scientific point of view consequence that we won't get to see people like this again.
So a curator's coming now to open it up, just as you did when you came here with Sidney. So the whole glass side of the case looks like it's being undone now for us. Oh, the door's open.
Oh yeah, that's better, isn't it?
Oh yes, you can see it more clearly.
Yes, that's the feed handle that he touched. Yeah.
Oh, so there's a little handle in the front.
Yeah,
and you turn
that pushes the cutting tool in and out, you see. And that sort of switched him on, and then he ran his hand all over it. That's a lot of fun, isn't it, seeing that again? Just over 50 years, yeah. Long time.
Richard Gregory, who died in May, ending today's case study. The reader was